Tonight, if you wake up at 2 a.m. and lie there with thoughts that feel too large, too real, too impossible to put down, something is happening that isn't insomnia, it isn't a disorder, it isn't a failure of self-discipline or sleep hygiene. It is one of the oldest cognitive states in human existence, a state that had a purpose in the structure of the night for most of human history, before anyone told you it was wrong. Understanding it changes everything about how you think about sleep, about why stories exist, about what your mind actually becomes when the day finally lets go. This is the story of the human night. For almost all of human existence, night meant something far more decisive than it does now. The sun would drop below the horizon, and within minutes the world became almost unreadable. Shapes blurred, distances dissolved, the boundaries between objects softened into shadow, and somewhere out there in that darkness, things were moving that could see far better than you could. To understand what happened to the human mind, you have to start here, in the dark, with the predators. The earliest members of our lineage, the Australopithecines, the group that includes the famous fossil known as Lucy, were not impressive animals by any obvious measure. They walked upright, which was genuinely new and significant, but they were small, 3.5, maybe 4 feet tall, moving through landscapes populated by predators that dwarfed them entirely. Saber-toothed cats with canines the length of your hand, hyenas the size of lions with jaws built to crush bone, birds of prey with wingspans wider than a man is tall, and along the river systems, 25-foot crocodiles that could swallow an Australopithecine whole in one bite. And early humans were, to put it plainly, prey. The fossil record makes that uncomfortably clear. Teeth marks on bones, talon marks on skull fragments. The Taung child, one of the most famous early hominin fossils ever found, is now believed to have been killed by a large bird of prey, snatched up probably the way an eagle takes a rabbit. Estimates suggest somewhere between 6 and 10% of individuals in some populations were killed by predators. That rate places early hominins in roughly the same category as small antelope. Predators were everywhere, and predators, crucially, are most active at night, which is why, like almost every other primate on Earth, our early ancestors slept in trees. Branches are hard for large carnivores to climb. Height gives you a view of what's moving below. Many primates, chimpanzees, orangutans, construct sleeping nests every night, bending and weaving branches into a platform sturdy enough to hold their weight. The construction is deliberate. The location is chosen carefully. The whole arrangement is a nightly negotiation with the dark. But tree sleeping has its own costs. Branches shift in the wind. Platforms degrade. Group members crowd together for warmth and disturb each other constantly. Snakes climb up. Sudden sounds trigger jolts back to wakefulness. Anthropologist David Sampson calls this economy class sleep. You're technically resting, but you're never fully relaxed. The body stays slightly braced. The brain never fully lets go. To get enough actual rest up there, you have to stay a long time. Sleep longer, because the sleep itself never goes deep enough. You know that sudden jerk and feeling off falling, that wakes you just as you're falling asleep. One theory is that it's a relic of sleeping in trees. The moment your muscles finally begin to relax fully, something fires and pulls you back so that you don't fall off the branch. So that was the situation. Small, hunted, sleeping in trees in fragmented, restless bursts, braced against a dark full of things that wanted to eat them. And then something changed. Around 2 million years ago, a new kind of hominin emerged, Homo erectus, taller, longer-legged, bodies increasingly built for open landscape travel rather than canopy life, sometimes reaching 5 to 6 feet in height. At some point, climbing back up every night stopped being practical. They came down from the trees and slept on the ground, in predator country, in the dark, with the saber-toothed cats and the giant hyenas and the 25-foot crocodiles still very much out there. And they did that for 1.5 million years. How did they manage that? Start with the sleep itself, because something extraordinary happened when they came down from the trees. On stable ground, the body could finally do something it had never been able to do before. It could actually let go. Muscles stopped bracing against the possibility of falling. Sleep got deeper, more consolidated, and when sleep gets deep enough, the brain can accomplish in fewer hours what fragmented tree sleep required many more hours to do. Every other primate compensates for bad sleep by sleeping more. Chimpanzees sleep 9.5 hours. Mouse lemurs sleep 17. Even the night monkey, an animal whose entire identity is built around being awake after dark, spends the majority of its life asleep. Humans sleep 7, the shortest sleeping primate on the planet. And when sleep gets deep enough, the brain can accomplish in fewer hours what fragmented, restless tree sleep required many more hours to do, which meant they were awake more. And not only were individuals awake more hours, the group as a whole was never fully asleep. Different people have different chronotypes, biological tendencies to sleep early or late, to wake before dawn, or stay alert deep into the night. When researchers observed sleep among the Hadza of Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer groups on Earth, they found that over a 20-day period, the entire camp was simultaneously asleep for a total of about 18 minutes. 18 minutes out of 20 days. Someone was nearly always awake, listening, present, and the ones who were sleeping may not have looked entirely asleep. There's a theory, debated but hard to forget once you've heard it, that human eyebrows and eyelashes evolved partly as a visual bluff. The upward arch of the brow and the downward curve of the lash together create something that resembles open eyes, just enough that a predator approaching a sleeping human in low light might pause. And then there was the noise. Almost every prey species on the savanna goes silent at night. Silence means invisibility. Silence means safety. Homo erectus did something almost no other ground-dwelling prey species does. They made noise, loud, rhythmic, coordinated group sound, singing. Not despite the predators, because of them. Researchers call this aposematic behavior, using conspicuous signals to warn danger away, rather than hiding from it. Something large is here, something that moves together and makes sounds that don't fit any pattern you know. Don't. Come. Close. And if something did come close, if something did take someone from the group, Homo erectus remembered. Unlike almost every other prey animal on that landscape, they didn't absorb the loss and move on. They took revenge. Hour after hour through the heat of the day, those long legs eating up the ground, that extraordinary capacity to sweat keeping them cool, long after the predator's own cooling system had failed. They would run it down over miles and over days if necessary, That is what 1.5 million years on the ground in the dark looks like. Sentinels who never fully slept, eyes that looked open even when closed, noise where everything else went silent, and a willingness to follow that no predator had evolved to expect. It was enough to survive. Until around 400,000 years ago, something arrived that changed the night entirely, and that was fire. Humans had encountered fire long before they learned to keep it. Lightning strikes dry grass, lava flows through forest, a naturally burning branch falls across a path. Many animals have watched fire happen. Encountering fire is not the thing. The thing is something different entirely. The question is when fire stopped being an event and became an environment. That is a very different threshold. You can imagine an early hominin approaching the blackened remains of a naturally burned patch of woodland, turning over a still warm branch, carrying a smoldering ember a short distance, warming hands over it for a moment before it dies. That kind of fleeting contact appears in the archaeological record very early. Reddened sediments, blackened bones, ash found deep inside Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, in a place so far from any entrance that natural wildfire becomes almost impossible as an explanation. Something was burning in there deliberately, perhaps 1 million years ago. And yet the evidence keeps appearing and then vanishing again. Fire shows up in the record and then disappears for long stretches. Entire regions where you would expect fire to be indispensable, cold places, dangerous places, show almost no evidence of regular use for thousands of years at a time. What this suggests is that early fire knowledge was fragile, difficult to preserve, difficult to pass on, socially uneven, possessed by some groups and completely absent in others, more like a rare and precarious skill than a stable inheritance. For hundreds of thousands of years, it stayed that way. Intermittent, opportunistic, almost secretive. And then, around 400,000 years ago, something shifts. Hearth structures begin appearing. Burning happens repeatedly in the same locations. At sites like Gesher Beno Yaakov in the Levant, there are multiple concentrations of burned wood, plant material, flint, even evidence of fish being processed near the fire. Fire has stopped being incidental. It has become organized. It now occupies a place. And once fire occupies a place, night is no longer what it was. A campfire creates a geometry. Before fire, night arrives as a kind of ecological closure. The visual world collapses. Movement becomes dangerous. Social coordination contracts, and whatever remains of collective life is forced inward toward silence and vigilance. But within Firelight, a small, unstable, flickering circle against the dark, something persists after sunset that had never persisted before. Not daylight prolonged exactly. The fire is too dim for that, too local, too alive with its own movement. Something softer, something narrower, a world with a center. Inside that circle, there is warmth, there is visibility, and there is something that none of the other defenses could offer. Something that didn't require anyone to be awake, or watching, or singing into the dark. Large carnivores are wary of flames, the heat, the movement, the smell of smoke. All of it changes the calculation of approach. A lion that might have crept silently toward a sleeping group in total darkness will often stop at the edge of firelight. Not always, not a guarantee, but enough to change the odds in a way that singing and revenge and sleeping in shifts could never quite manage alone. For the first time, something was actively holding the night back, and what that did to sleep goes deeper than just feeling safer. Homo erectus had already changed their sleep by coming down from the trees, that deeper, more efficient sleep that let them get more from fewer hours, but fire deepened it further. Under protection, in warmth, with the worst threats held at a distance, the body could relax in a way it had never quite managed before, even on the open ground. The muscles letting go more completely, the brain dropping into longer and more sustained periods of the deep restorative sleep that makes us who we are. Around 200,000 years ago, there is evidence that humans were periodically burning their grass sleeping beds, not for warmth, but to kill the insects and parasites that accumulated in them, then sleeping on the clean ash underneath. The management of the fire environment had become domestic, deliberate, woven into the small details of daily life in ways that go far beyond protection from predators. The hearth had become a place you tended, and because that light was warm, red, orange, amber, rather than the blue rich light that tells the brain it's still day, the body could remain awake beside it for hours without ever losing its sense that night had begun. The fire extended the evening without stealing the night. Our ancestors did not conquer the night by defeating it. They carved out a small, flickering world within it, neither fully day nor fully night. The visual world narrowed to the circle of warmth, the darkness pressing in at the edges. Something that had flickered in and out of human life for 1,000,000 years, fragile and intermittent and impossible to hold on to, had finally become something you could come back to every night. And in that illuminated margin, something distinctly human began to take form, the beginnings of the shared mental world we call culture. Because once you have warmth and safety and the long hours of darkness together, once people are sitting still in the same circle, awake, for the first time in their evolutionary history, with nowhere to be and nothing to hide from, the question becomes, what do humans actually do with that? And the answer turns out to be something that rewired the species. Somewhere inside you is the ability to rehearse dying without dying, to practice betrayal without being betrayed, to feel afraid on behalf of someone who doesn't exist, grieve for characters and stories, understand the intentions of people you have never met and will never meet. You can remember things that happened before you were born, not just facts, but the emotional texture of events, the moral weight of choices made by people who died thousands of years ago. You carry inside you a model of the world that extends far beyond anything you have personally experienced. That is not a small thing. Most animals cannot do it at all. And the question of how you came to be capable of it leads, surprisingly directly, back to a circle of people sitting around a fire in the dark. When the fire is lit at the end of the day, something shifts in what people want to talk about, so completely, so consistently, across every culture that has been studied, that it starts to look less like a preference and more like a different mode of being human altogether. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner documented this across decades of fieldwork with the Jukwasi of the Kalahari, recording hundreds of conversations day and night. And her data puts a precise number on something most people have felt, but never quite named. During daylight hours, roughly 2/3 of all conversation is economic management and social policing. Who contributed, who didn't, who needs to be corrected before an imbalance becomes dangerous. The Jukwasi are an egalitarian society, which means maintaining that equality is active daily work, monitored, enforced, negotiated out loud. Then the fire is lit. Economic talk drops from 31% of conversation to 4%. Criticism and complaint from 34% to 7%. Storytelling, just 6% of daytime conversation, becomes 81% of everything said after dark. The group that spent its daylight hours managing itself through friction spends the night almost entirely inside narrative, as though the fire had switched something over in the collective mind. So, what is story actually doing? Why does the human mind reach for it so automatically the moment the practical demands of the day are suspended? A story is a simulation. Researchers describe it as a kind of mental flight simulator, something that lets a person rehearse emotionally and socially complicated situations without incurring their costs. Through narrative, you can practice being in danger, betrayal, loss, trickery, grief, without any of it actually happening to you. You build an experiential library entirely through imagination, at no physical risk whatsoever. This is why stories are so much better remembered than instructions. A list of rules is fragile, but a story embeds the same information in sequence, emotion, image, and motive, gives abstract knowledge a body the memory can hold, and the body responds to it as though it were real. Emotionally engaging stories increase oxytocin, the neurochemical associated with trust and social bonding. Tension within a story raises cortisol just enough to sharpen attention and make the outcome matter. The brain's mirror systems allow you to internally simulate the actions and emotions of characters you're hearing about, which means a good story isn't neutral information processed at a distance. It is vicarious experience, happening to you in real time, for free. You are practicing being someone else. You are practicing caring about outcomes that aren't yours. You are practicing, in other words, the thing that makes you capable of empathy at all. Among the Agta foragers of the Philippines, researchers found that being a skilled storyteller was twice as predictive of being chosen as a campmate as being a skilled hunter. Twice. The presence of a skilled storyteller in a camp was directly associated with measurable increases in cooperative behavior among its members, and skilled storytellers had more children surviving to adulthood. The ability to tell a story well was a genuine survival advantage, not just for the storyteller, but for everyone who listened, because everyone who listened became slightly more capable of understanding other minds, navigating social complexity, holding the group together through difficulty. This is how culture actually works, not through rules or laws or explicit instruction, but through the accumulated practice of inhabiting other people's perspectives, night after night, for hundreds of thousands of years. The implications for memory alone are staggering. The Gunditjmara people of southeastern Australia have a story about 4 giant beings arriving in the landscape, 3 moving on, 1 crouching in place and transforming into a volcano, spitting out teeth of lava that flowed to the sea and created the coastal wetlands. Geologists, using radiocarbon dating of the twin eruptions of Bujibim and Tower Hill, confirmed that this event occurred approximately 37,000 years ago, and that the lava flow did indeed reach the sea, exactly as the story describes. 37,000 years. Sit with that for a moment. Before writing, before agriculture, before any civilization we have a name for, a story about something that happened, a real geological event with real geographic consequences, passed from voice to voice around fires, across a span of time so vast it swallows all of recorded human history several times over, and arriving intact. The details preserved not in stone or clay or paper, but in the act of telling, repeated and remembered, and handed forward into a future no one could see. That is what narrative actually is. A technology for extending human memory beyond the limits of a single lifetime, beyond the horizon of direct experience, across generations and centuries, and apparently across 37,000 years. Among the Andaman Islanders, stories that appear on the surface to be about animals marrying each other turn out, on closer examination, to encode precise information about where specific animals can be found, how they behave, and how to track them. The story is the database. It just wears a different face so the memory can hold it. Stories remember what the group must not forget. And they do something even more intimate than that. They train you to live among other minds. To follow a good story, you must track not only actions but motives, not only what happened but what a character believed, feared, concealed, misjudged, desired. The richer the story, the longer it holds its characters in moral uncertainty, the more you have to keep modeling other people's interiority. Keep asking what this person is really thinking, what they actually want, what they are hiding. That is not a small cognitive skill. It is one of the core demands of social life, and humans were practicing it every single night for hundreds of thousands of years in the dark. The low light made detailed work almost impossible. You couldn't forage in firelight, couldn't scan the horizon, couldn't do much of anything except sit and speak and listen, which meant the evening, for the first time, belonged to something other than survival. Imagine sitting in that circle, the fire low, the voice of someone you trust, moving through the dark toward you, your body warm and your mind somewhere else entirely. Inside a story about a hunt that happened last season, or a marriage that went wrong 2 valleys over, or something that happened to your grandmother's grandmother's grandmother, in a landscape you have never seen. You are not there, and yet you are learning something about that place, those people, that situation that you could not have learned any other way. You are expanding beyond your own experience. You are becoming incrementally capable of understanding a world larger than the one you can see. This is how humans maintained relationships across distances of up to 120 miles, such as the Jukwasi, Zaro partnerships, long-distance gift networks that functioned as a distributed insurance system, where distant partners could be the difference between survival and starvation in times of drought or conflict. Maintaining those relationships required that absent people remain present in your mind, that you could picture them, feel something for them, understand their situation without ever being in it. Firelight storytelling kept absent people socially alive inside the circle, sustained in shared imagination across distances no one could walk in a single day. Fireside storytelling was the original social media, except what it was transmitting wasn't content, it was the capacity for connection itself. As the night deepened, the stories deepened with it. In daylight, the world is visible and bounded. Objects are stable, Distances can be estimated. Tasks are concrete. At night, the visible world contracts to the edge of the fire, and beyond it lie sounds, silhouettes, intervals, and the unresolved. The unknown stops being abstract. It becomes present, just outside the light. Under those conditions, questions that daylight keeps at a manageable distance begin to press inward. Where did all of this come from? What is moving out there? What becomes of the dead? Why does fear arrive before its object? Why do dreams feel inhabited? What are the stars? And why do they return in the same patterns every year? These are not idle questions. They are the questions that become possible when a group of humans is warm enough, safe enough, and awake enough to ask them, held together in the dark by a voice, with the practical demands of the day finally suspended. Myth is not primitive explanation. It is what happens when human minds, freed temporarily from the work of survival, turn toward the larger structure of existence and try to make it hold together. It is existential uncertainty, moral order, danger, ancestry, and natural pattern woven into a structure the group can inhabit, not answering questions so much as placing the listener inside a world where the questions feel meaningful rather than terrifying. Fear, inside the circle, becomes something different than it is outside it. A frightening story raises arousal and sharpens attention while the body stays warm and safe, and when it resolves, through laughter, catharsis, relief, or revelation, the group returns to itself more tightly bonded than before. The fractures of the day get reabsorbed into a larger emotional frame. Among the Jukwazi, nighttime healing dances could continue for hours. Participants circling the fire while singers sustained a rhythmic field of sound, and healers entered altered states, understood as contact with forces beyond ordinary waking life. Similar rituals appear across widely separated cultures that had no contact with each other, all of them converging on the same conditions: darkness, rhythmic sound, social synchrony, prolonged attention, heat, fatigue, flicker. The conditions under which the boundary between individual and group becomes temporarily permeable. The conditions under which ordinary consciousness loosens and collective feeling intensifies. The sensory environment itself was doing something. Firelight is dim, warm, and unstable. It narrows the visual field, reduces peripheral distraction, makes you present but softened by shadow, seen but not inspected. The rhythmic movement of flame produces a measurable shift toward parasympathetic relaxation that researchers have called campfire calm, something the steady light of a room simply cannot replicate. In the dark, the voice becomes the primary instrument, traveling without line of sight, reaching listeners who are half reclined, eyes closed, not even facing the speaker, holding everyone inside the same imaginative space, regardless of where they are in the circle. A single voice in the right conditions, holding a group of humans inside a shared world. This is what assembled itself inside that circle over hundreds of thousands of years. 81% of the night given over to story, oral traditions preserving the memory of volcanic eruptions across 37,000 years. Storytellers valued more than hunters. The capacity for empathy, for inhabiting other minds, for holding relationships across vast distances, for asking questions too large for daylight. All of it practiced, refined, transmitted, and deepened, night after night, in a small zone of warmth against the dark. This is the foundation of what culture actually is. Not art museums or written languages or religious traditions, those are its products, the things it eventually made. Culture is based on the capacity to hold a shared world in common, to know things together, to remember across a span of time so vast no single lifetime could contain it, to feel things together, grief, fear, wonder, belonging, on behalf of people and places and events far beyond the reach of personal experience. That capacity didn't arrive with civilization. It assembled itself piece by piece, night after night, in a small circle of warmth against the dark. But there's something we haven't talked about yet. Something happening to the individual mind inside that circle, to the specific cognitive state of being awake in the dark, held in warmth, hearing a voice. And this part of the story is stranger and more personal than anything we've covered so far, because it turns out the night does something to how you think, something measurable, something that makes the Firelight gathering not just culturally productive, but cognitively necessary. Something shifts late at night. The mind becomes less contained. Thoughts no longer held in the same tight structure they are during the day. Sometimes that openness moves toward worry, a problem expanding until it feels inescapable, a regret that takes up more room than it should. Sometimes it moves in the opposite direction. Ideas feel clearer, possibilities feel real. Plans that seemed out of reach during the day suddenly feel like something you could actually do. It is the same underlying change either way. A mind that has stopped holding itself quite so tightly. Where it goes depends on what it finds when it opens. This is not imagination. It is not weakness or irrationality. The brain that is running in the middle of the night is genuinely, measurably, not the same brain that was running in the middle of the day. The architecture has shifted. Different systems are in charge. Human wakefulness runs on two parallel systems that spend most of the day working against each other. The first is biochemical pressure, adenosine accumulating in the brain throughout the day, making thought progressively more effortful, the pull toward sleep gradually harder to resist. The second is your circadian rhythm, sending wake-promoting signals during daylight hours and sleep-promoting signals after dark. During the day, these two systems counterbalance each other. The circadian system even peaks in the early evening, a kind of biological defiance that keeps you surprisingly alert even after many hours awake, which is why falling asleep at 9 p.m. can be unexpectedly difficult. The body hasn't yielded yet, but as the night deepens, that resistance collapses. The circadian wake signal reaches its lowest point somewhere in the pre-dawn hours, at precisely the same moment that accumulated sleep pressure is near its peak. The brain is being pulled toward unconsciousness from two directions at once, and the brain navigating that state is running a different configuration than it was at noon. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for long-term planning, impulse regulation, rational comparison, the inhibition of immediate emotional reactions becomes less effective. Parts of the waking brain begin to resemble the electrical patterns of sleep. At the same time, the subcortical systems involved in emotional significance, the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens, become relatively more influential. The internal governor dims. The emotionally charged systems get louder, which is why the night makes thoughts feel larger. The same situation, processed by the same person, reads differently at different hours because it is literally being processed by a different configuration of systems. The evidence for this is not subtle. Rates of impulsive decisions, self-harm, and substance misuse all rise disproportionately during nocturnal wakefulness, even after accounting for the fact that fewer people are awake then. Reason does not disappear at night. It grows tired, and when reason grows tired, older systems, faster, more emotionally primitive, less supervisory, are given more room to speak. The prefrontal cortex is not only a governor, it is also a filter. During the day, it suppresses weak associations, constrains irrelevant possibilities, keeps thought aligned with practical tasks. This is what lets you function. But the same filtering that supports disciplined action can prevent novel association. Ideas that sit too far apart in daylight may drift closer together at night. Strange analogies become thinkable. The boundaries between memory and symbol and image and possibility soften. The night is a poor time for evaluation and an excellent time for emergence. What feels like catastrophizing from one angle is, from another, a mind that has become unusually permeable, open to connections it would ordinarily reject, available to questions it would ordinarily defer. This is the cognitive state the people around those fires were actually in. The loosening of executive control that makes the small hours feel dangerous when you are alone becomes inside warmth and safety and rhythm and the presence of other minds, the raw material of something else entirely. Imagine sitting in that circle, the fire low, a voice moving through the dark, your associative thinking loosened, your emotional salience heightened, your sensory certainty reduced, a sound beyond the fire that no one can identify. Someone proposes an explanation, someone else elaborates it, another recalls something similar from another night. Before long, the group is no longer reacting to an unexplained sound. It is inhabiting a shared framework of agency and motive and possibility. This may be one of the conditions that made mythic thinking possible. The specific cognitive mode of humans awake in the dark together, associative thinking loosened, emotional salience heightened, sensory certainty reduced, creates exactly the kind of mental environment in which the unknown becomes narratively fertile. Something is out there. Something could be intending. Something may be watching. The tendency to infer agency under uncertainty, which in isolation can produce anxiety, may, in the collective firelit setting, become the raw material for spirits, ancestors, gods, unseen forces. Myth may not be fabricated explanation so much as socially stabilized nocturnal cognition, the night mind held inside the circle, given a voice and an audience and a fire. The modern ideal, 8 uninterrupted hours, a single continuous block from bedtime to morning, is historically almost unprecedented. Before electric light, across cultures on every continent, the standard human sleep pattern was biphasic. First sleep and second sleep, with an hour or more of quiet wakefulness in between. Historian Roger E. Kirch documented over 500 references to this pattern in diaries, court records, medical texts, and literature from pre-industrial Europe alone. The Tiv people of Nigeria used first sleep and second sleep as traditional intervals for marking time. The Wulwa of Central America gathered around fires after first sleep to share stories. The Tupinamba of Brazil rose after first sleep to eat before returning to rest. That midnight interval was not insomnia. It was not a problem to be solved. It was a distinct physiological state. The brain during that wakefulness shows elevated levels of prolactin, a pituitary hormone that produces a particular quality of relaxed meditative calm. unlike ordinary wakefulness. Pre-industrial writers described it as cherished, a time for prayer and reflection, for interpreting the vivid dreams that came more easily in that window, for scholars to write, for neighbors to visit, for a kind of quiet thinking that the busy hours of the day made impossible. In 1992, a researcher confined subjects to 14 hours of darkness daily for a month. After clearing their accumulated sleep debt, they naturally reverted to the biphasic pattern: 4 hours of sleep, then 1 to 3 hours of quiet wakefulness, then 4 more hours of sleep. The body returned to something closer to the conditions it evolved in, remembered what it had always known. If you wake at midnight and cannot get back to sleep, it may be worth knowing that for most of human history, that was not a disorder. It was an appointment, a window your biology has been keeping since long before anyone told you it was wrong. The difference between that experience as gift and that experience as suffering may come down, more than anything else, to what surrounds it. A person alone, awake in the quiet, may feel the night mind turn inward, thoughts becoming more vivid, more absorbing, sometimes heavier than they did during the day. The same loosening, the same openness, but without anything to hold it, it can begin to fold back on itself. But that is only one expression of it, that same state held differently, inside warmth or rhythm or the presence of other minds, can move in another direction entirely. The very same openness that can make a worry feel larger can also make an idea feel possible. The same associative drift that can circle a regret can just as easily assemble something new. Nothing about the state itself is fixed. It does not decide in advance what it will become. The biology is the same. The direction is not. This is what fire offered the human mind. Not only protection from the dark, but a way of being inside it. A structure strong enough to hold this more open form of thinking without collapsing into it. A way for that loosened, less filtered, more associative state to become shared, shaped into story, into meaning, into something that could be carried forward. The night was never simply the time after day. It was a different cognitive country, and when humans found ways to inhabit it, together, or in ways that gave it form, it did not only produce fear or uncertainty, it also made room for a different kind of clarity, for ideas that arrive only when nothing is pressing in on them, for thoughts that are harder to reach when the mind is holding itself tightly, and for a way of thinking that does not replace the daytime mind, but sits beside it, quieter, looser, and sometimes unexpectedly more expansive. Around 300 years ago, something arrived that ended the firelit night almost completely, not with a bang, quietly, incrementally, light by light, and the consequences of that, biological, psychological, civilizational, are still unfolding around us right now. For roughly 99% of human existence, every source of light after sunset belonged to the same family. Fire, embers, torches, candles, oil lamps, all of them incandescent, all of them warm, all of them producing light by heating material until it glows. Red, orange, amber, almost no blue. The campfire was, in biological terms, polite. It let you stay awake without telling your body it was still day. That distinction matters more than it might seem, because the human eye is not only an instrument for seeing. Buried within the retina is a second system that has nothing to do with vision in the ordinary sense. A set of cells that measure the quality of ambient light and use that information to set the body's internal clock. These cells contain a photopigment called melanopsin, and melanopsin is especially sensitive to one specific wavelength, blue light, around 480 nanometers. When blue-rich light hits these cells, they send a signal to the brain. It is daytime. Melatonin is suppressed. The body's transition toward night is delayed. Firelight produces almost none of that signal, which means that for most of human history, people could sit awake beside a fire for hours, and their bodies would still understand, at a biological level, that night had begun. The fire extended the evening without stealing the night. Modern light does something else entirely. Most white LEDs are not, in spectral terms, white at all. They are blue-heavy devices disguised as neutral illumination, a strong blue emitter used to excite phosphors that produce longer wavelengths, giving the impression of white light while the blue spike remains. The eye sees a pleasant domestic light. The body's clock sees something closer to dawn. And because modern people live surrounded by these sources, overhead lighting, laptop screens, phone displays, tablets, televisions, street lights, the tiny status lights on appliances blinking in dark rooms, the body receives a spectral environment it was never designed to inhabit continuously. For most of human history, the pattern was stark: bright blue days, dim, warm nights, strong contrast, clear signal. The body always knew where it was in the cycle. Now that contrast has blurred into what researchers call light monotony, days spent largely indoors under relatively weak illumination, evenings spent under blue-rich artificial light. The day is biologically dimmer than it should be. The night is biologically brighter. From the perspective of the circadian system, both ends are wrong. In 2015, researchers studied 2 communities of Tobacón people in the Argentinian Gran Chaco, one with access to electric light, one still living primarily by natural light and fire. The community with electricity slept 43 minutes less per night in summer and 56 minutes less in winter, almost entirely because of later bedtimes. Wake times barely changed. The body still had to rise. It simply rose after a shorter night. And because the Tobacón with electricity had significantly less access to screens and media than most people in industrialized societies, the researchers noted that their results almost certainly underestimate the full effect of electric light on human sleep. The chronic compression this produces is not trivial. Sleep onset is delayed. Melatonin rises later. REM timing shifts. The body's metabolic systems, which are themselves circadian, begin operating against an environment whose timing signals no longer match the solar cycle. Circadian disruption has been associated with metabolic dysfunction, cardiovascular strain, depressive symptoms, obesity, insulin irregularities, even increased cancer risk in long-term shift workers. The built environment has become, without anyone deciding this, a chronobiological experiment run on the entire species simultaneously. The good news is that the damage reverses quickly. In 2013, a team at the University of Colorado sent 8 participants on a week-long camping trip with no artificial light, no flashlights, no screens. After 7 days of bright blue days and genuinely dark nights, lit only by campfire, their melatonin rhythms had fully synchronized to the solar cycle. Their internal clocks, delayed and disrupted by months of modern light, reset in a week. The body remembers what it is supposed to do. It just needs the signal. But the biological disruption is only part of what electric light took. In some ways, it is not even the most important part. A fire gathers people. It creates a center. Its low light makes detailed work difficult. You cannot forage in firelight, cannot scan the horizon, cannot perform most visually demanding tasks. And that constraint, which sounds like a limitation, turns out to be a kind of protection. There's only so much you can do by firelight except sit, speak, sing, listen, remember. The medium itself enforces a particular kind of evening. Electric light breaks that arrangement completely. Once light becomes bright, portable, cheap, and easily distributed, the evening can become anything at all. Work time, shopping time, scrolling time, administrative time. The old social contraction around a single luminous center dissolves. As Polly Wiesner observed, artificial light turns potential social time into potential work time. What was once structurally protected becomes colonizable. The privatization this produces is something strange to sit with. A person once sat in a mixed-age circle and heard the same story as everyone else. The same silence, the same song, the same laugh, the same crackle of wood, the same warning about some animal or ancestor whose name every child in the group would know. Now the evening splits into parallel channels. One person scrolls alone, another answers work email, another watches something on headphones, another lies in bed under the light of a phone. Everyone awake at once, and the night no longer shared. A night full of stimulation and starved of common attention. The appetite hasn't disappeared. People still fall asleep to podcasts, documentaries, audiobooks, familiar voices. They still seek dimness, warmth, murmuring thought, the sense of not being alone in the dark, but also not being demanded of. The nervous system still expects night to feel a certain way, slower, narrower, less surveilled by performance, more favorable to the kind of drifting thought that happens when the day finally lets go. The old, firelit architecture of the evening keeps exerting pressure from underneath everything built on top of it. The container changed. The need inside it didn't. That preference may not be as modern as it seems. For most of human history, falling asleep rarely meant being alone in silence. In a firelit camp, the group settled together. Some people slept. Others remained awake, tending the fire, listening, present. Anthropologists sometimes refer to this as a sentinel pattern. At any given moment, someone in the group is still awake, still monitoring the edge of the dark. The human nervous system learned to treat that condition as information. Not something you had to think about, but something you could feel. A nearby voice, a shifting presence, the low murmur of someone who has not yet gone to sleep. Someone is still awake. The watch is being kept. It is safe to let go. In that sense, the body still remembers what the built environment forgot, which is why the efforts now appearing in architecture and medicine to restore something like biological darkness are so interesting. Hospitals experimenting with blue-depleted evening lighting have found reductions in arousal and improvements in sleep. Psychiatric wards using warmer, lower-intensity night lighting have observed calmer patients. Designers now speak of melanopic lux and circadian effective illumination, new metrics for a very old fact, which is that not all light is the same to the body. The red light therapy devices and infrared saunas that have become ordinary features of modern wellness culture are, at a biological level, people paying to approximate what firelight provided automatically for 400,000 years. the body knows what it needs. It has just lost the conditions under which it used to arrive without effort. In a sense, science and wellness culture are both slowly rediscovering the hearth by other means, arriving back at something that worked for 400,000 years before anyone thought to measure it. But where the firelit circle seems to have made its last stand is the bedtime story and the lullaby. When the communal hearth dissolved into private rooms, something of its structure survived in its most intimate form. A warm voice in a dim room, carrying a child toward sleep. The lullaby is the oldest version of this. Every culture that has ever been studied has them, in forms so similar across such vastly different peoples that it stops looking like cultural coincidence and starts looking like biology. Slow tempo, falling pitch, repetition, a voice at low arousal that signals someone is here, the night is inhabited, it is safe to let go. What's striking, when you look closely at the content of lullabies, is how dark it often is. Rockabye Baby ends with a cradle falling from a tree. Traditional lullabies across Europe and Asia regularly involve loss, danger, even death, delivered in the softest possible voice. This is the first introduction to something the firelit circle had always known. Fear can be held inside warmth. The darkness can be named and survived. The soothing delivery is not despite the frightening content. It is because of it. As children grow, the lullaby gives way to the folk tale, and the training becomes more explicit. The wolf at the door, the witch in the forest, the monster under the bed, almost always scaled, researchers have noted, to exactly the size of an adult, which is to say, the size of the most powerful beings in a child's actual world. These stories are calibration tools. They let children rehearse danger and watch it be survived, usually through cleverness rather than strength. The small outsmarting the large is one of the most universal structures in human folklore across every culture that has ever told stories. It is not a coincidence that this is also the situation of every child who has ever lived. The vertical transmission that once ran from elders to the whole group in the firelit circle now runs through the bedroom. The same information moving through the same mechanism. Voice, dark, the threshold between waking and sleep, just distilled to its most essential form. What was lost when artificial light turned bonding time into work time is not abstract. Parents now often feel they have 15 minutes for a bedtime story before the evening's other demands pull them back. 15 minutes for something that once lasted hours. The circle didn't disappear. It just got very small and very pressured, and is now competing with everything the lit evening makes possible instead. The point is not to return to fire. It is to recognize that the body still expects a meaningful descent into night, that the contrast between day and dark was never merely aesthetic but biological, carrying information the nervous system used to organize everything from sleep to metabolism to mood. And that when that contrast disappears, something the body was counting on goes with it. One version of night replaced another, one in which biological timing, collective attention, and shared imagination were loosely aligned, another in which they are routinely pulled apart. The consequences of that are not only medical, they are civilizational. And what happened to the one place that last held the firelit circle together? The bedtime story, the lullaby, the voice in the dark at the threshold of sleep, tells us something important about what we lost and what the body is still reaching for. Long before fire, before language, before the stories that traveled 37,000 years, and the healing dances and the myths that placed the listener inside a meaningful world, the human ear was already changing. Even in our earliest ancestors, those Australopithecines, 4 feet tall and moving through a landscape full of things that wanted to eat them, the ear was being shaped for something specific, shorter, wider, oriented toward receiving the human voice at close range. Not birdsong, not wind, not the general noise of the savannah, but the nearby human voice at the particular frequencies of intimate speech. That structure is the direct precursor to the ear you have now, refined over millions of years toward exactly the same thing. The body was building the receiver before there was much to transmit, which means the expectation came first. A voice nearby, something present in the dark, before story, before myth, before there was even a reliable way to remain together safely after sunset. Fire did not create that expectation, it answered it. For the first time, the night had a center, a place where the voice could carry in conditions that supported it. Warm light that did not confuse the body, a shared space that did not demand constant vigilance. And inside that space, something larger than comfort or safety began to take form. Story, memory, meaning, but also something more structural than any of those on their own. The ability to hold a shared world in common, to place multiple minds inside the same imagined space, to feel the same thing at the same moment, to remember not just individually, but together, across distances of time no single life could span. What we call culture did not begin as an abstraction or a system. It began as a condition, a circle of light, a narrowing of attention, a voice that could reach everyone at once. The firelit circle was not the beginning of the human need for warmth and voice and shared darkness. It was the first time the night had something to offer in return. The fire went out, the light changed, the circle dissolved into parallel channels of private attention, the evening expanded into something brighter and longer and more fragmented. The conditions that once made that shared space inevitable became optional, then rare, but the expectation did not change with them. The body still waits for a descent into night that makes sense, for light that softens instead of interrupts, for attention that gathers instead of scatters, for the feeling, however faint, that the dark is inhabited and the watch is being kept. The lullaby is still sung, the bedtime story is still told, even in 15 minutes, even against the pull of everything the lit evening makes possible instead. The familiar voice still plays softly in the background as sleep approaches. None of these are accidents. None of them are modern inventions. They are the last shapes of something very old, persisting in whatever form the present allows. Long before the first fire was kept, the ear was already listening. And though the fire has gone out a long time ago, the ear has been listening ever since.